America has begun to reopen. In April, over 95% of our nation's citizens were under lockdown. From California to North Carolina, over 20 states have lifted restrictions and allowed the return of some normalcy. Liberal congressional leaders continue to ponder new spending bills to pander to the masses and remain on a path of spending our way out of this economic crisis. How does this all look, and how will it all shake out? I'll discuss this and more today on the Closet Conservative Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Wright. Let's get started. In the U.S., there are over 1.2 million COVID-19 infections, and over 75,000 Americans have lost their lives to this virus. Last week, the Trump administration allowed the social distancing guidelines to expire, paving the way for states across the country to reopen in an attempt to restart and rejuvenate our distressed economy. The pandemic has ravaged the U.S. labor market, and 1 in 5 American workers have filed for first-time unemployment benefits since mid-March. However, continued data revealed by the IRS and the Department of Labor signal that perhaps the worst may indeed be behind us. And despite massive job losses in March, total unemployment claims have fallen for 5 straight weeks. Up until now, 3 different coronavirus relief bills have been passed and signed into law. Still, none of them delivered hazard pay specifically to those who operate daily on the front lines of this ongoing war. The new financial remedy from Congress would provide as much as $25,000 in premium hazard pay for essential workers, to include groups such as healthcare workers, grocery store clerks, and others who fought on the front lines against the coronavirus. But the spending doesn't stop there. Earlier this week, Forbes detailed some lawmakers who want to help by paying frontline workers student loans or higher education costs. A new bill introduced this week would also give essential workers $25,000 in student debt relief for the use of college tuition or expenses, for workforce development, or continuing education programs. Representatives Ann Custer and Brian Fitzpatrick introduced the bipartisan legislation called the Opportunities for Heroes Act. And if the bill were to become law, the Secretary of Labor would establish a new commission to determine which workers are deemed essential and eligible for the $25K. Some of the positions the bill mentions explicitly include, again, healthcare workers, first responders, pharmacy workers, grocery store workers, postal workers, and the list goes on and on. Essential workers who worked at least 480 hours in 120 days during the COVID-19 crisis would be eligible. Workers who couldn't reach the 480 hours due to any case of COVID-19 would still qualify. The bill would allow workers to transfer the money to a family member as well. So, for example, if an essential worker did not have student loans or desire to go to school or be retrained or re-educated in any way, they could use that money to pay for their child's education. But even before COVID-19, liberal legislators pandered to the masses of college students, all but guaranteeing student loan forgiveness. Squad member Omar has a plan to cancel an upwards of $30,000 per borrower for student debt. And the list goes on and on. More bills of Benjamins by our nation's governments and their attempt to spend our way out of this pandemic. The apparent VP frontrunner, Senator Kamala Harris, and the U.S. self-appointed father of socialism, Bernie Sanders, introduced new coronavirus relief legislation on Friday to provide reoccurring $2,000 monthly payments to most Americans during this pandemic. They coined the Monthly Economic Crisis Support Act on Friday that would give $2,000 a month to every individual with an income below $120,000 throughout the entire pandemic and for 3 months once it concludes. Married couples who file jointly would receive $4,000 a month. Families would also get $2,000 per child for up to 3 children. And the payments would be retroactive all the way back to March. The legislation ensures that all individuals, including undocumented workers, undocumented immigrants, the homeless, youth in foster homes, would also get money. That's right, you did not misunderstand me. Undocumented immigrants, undocumented workers would also receive funds. You know, those criminals who invaded our country illegally and who do not pay 1 red cent into our system would now receive monthly payments from that same system? It seems legit, right? The question that we all need to be asking ourselves is this: who the heck is going to pay for all of this? It surely isn't the government. Why? Well, because the government doesn't pay for anything. In fact, government and those employed within them are wholly dependent on solvent, tax-paying Americans. But ladies and gentlemen, the fact of the matter is this: we're broke. Recently, the U.S. Treasury Department estimated that our nation was tapped out on the first round of stimulus payments, citing their need to borrow over $3 trillion in the second quarter of 2020. Our nation's debt, after adding coronavirus stimulus packages, totals over $30 trillion, with no possible ceiling in sight. When the smoke clears in 2020, and hopefully with this virus in the dust, our nation's debt will exceed GDP for the first time ever in history. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the totality of our national economy. Throwing money at a problem will not solve a problem. In fact, it often worsens the initial problem. It is not the right of any local, state, or federal government to subsidize anything or anyone. Today's politicians, particularly those on the left side of the aisle, do not and will not comprehend this basic civil understanding. I want to shift gears for a moment and speak to a few other items that hit the news over the last week. In recent days, President Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have doubled down on the assertion that COVID-19 originated from a lab in Wuhan, China, where the outbreak was first detected last December. On Wednesday, China's foreign ministry called the assertions a political strategy to smear China for Republicans ahead of the 2020 election. CNN reported that Trump's allegation was pure fiction, citing that the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada also found no evidence that the Chinese manufactured the virus. First, let's consider this source. It's CNN. Most teenage gossip magazines contain more substantive matters to arguments and opinions than does the Communist News Network. But does Trump have a point? And I'd say he does. After the 2002 global SARS pandemic, China created a Bio-Level 4 viral center on its mainland, the same type of setup as our Centers for Disease Control and U.S. AMRID, which studies such viruses and bacteria as anthrax, influenza, Ebola, and other hemorrhagic fevers that have fallen into the wrong hands, could be weaponized and used for a biological attack. Are the American people to believe CNN and that Communist China has hung up their hammer and sickle and would never attempt to interject something like a novel virus across the world to bring its global competitors and their economies to their knees? Before COVID, and as a direct result of the Trump tariffs, the Chinese economy was in a steady decline. Losses of industry exports proved damaging. And like I've always said, I'm not a conspiracy theorist by any means. But for anyone to claim that the Chinese would not benefit from a worldwide pandemic is delusional. If there ever was a bandwagon to eliminate the United States, especially financially, the Chinese would be on board or be leading the convoy. The other top story for the week is the cooked-up Russian collusion theory that seems to be falling apart at the seams. Transcripts from dozens of such interviews were released Thursday by the House Intelligence Committee. Evelyn Farkas, a former Obama admin who previously encouraged congressional staffers to gather evidence of alleged collusion between President Trump's 2016 campaign and Russia, said she knew there was additional such information out there, admitted she did not know such details existed in 2017 during a most recent interview. Released this week were 2017-2018 House Intelligence Committee interviews, which showed that several top Obama officials, including Farkas, former Attorney General Loretta Lynch, former Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes, and former NSA Advisor Susan Rice, all said they had or knew of no hard evidence of Trump-Russia collusion. And there you have it, folks. The beginning of the end of the witch hunt against President Trump and his supposed ties to Russia during the 2016 election. Democrats dreamed this up, created an absolute farce in their efforts to defame Trump, and pad their impeachment files of deceit before the American people. Democrats are crafty, but the jig is up. The DOJ and the Trump administration guarantee that an onslaught of testimony and interviews will continue to be released, which will illustrate the entire allegation of Trump-Russia collusion was a complete fabrication. Ladies and gentlemen, as our nation begins to reopen, we must be cautious of the continued backstabbing, deceitful ways of today's Democratic Party. They have proven that they will weaponize anything against this president, and when in doubt, utterly lie and fabricate their version of the truth to destroy our president. Democrats have proven that they're not for this country. From COVID to China, their wise guys who weave webs of lies attempt to cause our nation harm. They want to spin our nation into oblivion, utterly implode our national economy, and bolster their rallying cries of more, bigger government. Today's liberals have lost their reality. For them, they are the only entity that can save our nation. And I'm here to tell you that is the biggest lie of all. Americans are a proud people. We are not sheep, and in thus we do not and should not choose slaughter over success. We do not need the government to tell us what to do and when to do it. As our nation reopens and our economy begins to recover, we need to understand that in a democracy, the role of citizen and government is very distinct and separate. As Americans, we have the capacity to learn, to love, and to carry on. These principles are individual in nature, and we do not require the use of government or their heavy influence. We should all give the finger to the iron fist of fascism, heavy-handed state and federal legislators who believe that they know best. I'm not buying or taking the bait, and I surely don't need a bailout to be successful. As always, I want to thank you all for tuning in today as our nation begins its recovery process. I want to remind each of you out there to be safe, and as always, be vigilant, but most important, be American. This is Eric Wright, and this has been the Closet Conservative Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to our podcast. Please remember to give a 5-star review and share our podcast with your friends. The Closet Conservative Podcast is a production of the Liberty Loft. Copyright The Liberty Loft, 2020. You can find more shows and information on our website, www.thelibertyloft.com, or any of our social media channels.